The Meridian Strategic Institute's Grand Amphitheatre had witnessed many momentous occasions throughout its 3-century existence. Treaties had been signed in its hallowed halls, trade agreements negotiated, and diplomatic disasters narrowly averted. But never before had it hosted quite such an assembly of military minds, each representing the pinnacle of their respective civilizations' approach to organized violence. Row upon row of tiered seating accommodated beings that would have sent xenobiologists into rapturous fits of academic ecstasy. The front sections buzzed with the electromagnetic signatures of the Veltar Consortium, their translucent forms shimmering as they communicated through controlled plasma discharges. Behind them, the insectoid hive speakers clicked and chittered in perfect unison, their compound eyes reflecting the amphitheater's adaptive lighting in mesmerizing kaleidoscope pattern. The middle tiers housed the more traditionally bipedal species, though traditional remained a remarkably flexible term when applied to beings with crystalline exoskeletons, photosynthetic skin patches, or the occasional extra limb or 3. And there, in the very back corner, sat a single human, unremarkable by galactic standards, possessed of only 2 arms, 2 legs, and a disappointing lack of natural armor plating or energy projection capabilities. The kind of being most advanced civilizations politely ignored at diplomatic functions, like a distant cousin at a family reunion who insisted on discussing their collection of antique projectile weapons. The day's distinguished guest speaker commanded attention from the moment he entered. General Vexmorth of the Krek Star Hegemony stood nearly 3 meters tall, his 4 arms moving in perfect synchronization as he adjusted his ceremonial battle harness. His crystalline carapace caught and refracted the amphitheater's light, creating rainbow patterns that seemed to dance across his form with each step. 2 of his arms carried traditional Krek Star honor staffs, while the other 2 manipulated a holographic display that materialized complex tactical diagrams in mid-air. The general's reputation preceded him like a particularly aggressive bout of space plague. Vexmorth had authored the definitive texts on quantum battlefield mechanics, pioneered the use of temporal displacement in siege warfare, and commanded fleets that could glass entire continents without leaving a single carbon signature behind. His lectures at the Institute were considered mandatory viewing for any serious student of advanced warfare theory. "Esteemed colleagues," the general began, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made crack-style communication sound like a choir of crystalline wind chimes. "Today, we gather to discuss the evolution of civilized combat in our modern galactic age." The word civilized rolled off his vocal apparatus with the kind of emphasis usually reserved for religious pronouncements or tax policy discussions. Several species in the audience shifted appreciatively in their seats, mandibles clicking and energy fields fluctuating in agreement. Gone are the primitive days when warfare consisted of hurling crude projectiles at one another, or detonating chemical compounds in hopes of achieving strategic objectives. Vexmor's upper arms gestured dismissively, while his lower ones continued manipulating the holographic display. "We have transcended such barbaric methodologies through the application of superior intellect and advanced technology." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled military minds. The Veltar Consortium representatives pulsed with approving colors, while the Hive speaker's antennae twitched in what passed for enthusiastic nodding among their kind. The general's first holographic demonstration materialized above the amphitheater's center stage, a 3-dimensional battlefield populated with geometric representations of various military units, all engaged in what appeared to be an elaborate dance of energy beams and force field deployments. "Observe the elegant simplicity of properly conducted warfare," Vexmorth continued, his secondary eyes tracking the holographic battle while his primary ones swept the audience. "Energy-based weapon systems eliminate the crude uncertainties of ballistic trajectories. Plasma shields provide absolute protection against primitive kinetic attacks. Quantum entanglement communication networks ensure instantaneous coordination across vast distances." The display showed sleek vessels maneuvering through space, their weapons firing beams of coherent energy that struck opposing shields in brilliant flashes of light. When shields failed, the targeted vessels simply dissolved into component atoms, disappearing from the battlefield with clinical efficiency. "Note the absence of collateral damage," the general pointed out with obvious pride. "No messy explosions, no debris fields, no environmental contamination. Simply the precise application of superior technology to achieve strategic objectives." Several members of the audience leaned forward in their seats, taking detailed notes on personal recording devices. The Zephyrian delegation's feathered crests rustled with interest, while the mechanical beings from the Synthex Collective whirred their approval through modulated frequency emissions. In the back corner, the human marine watched the display with the kind of expression typically worn by someone observing a particularly elaborate practical joke in progress. Her hand rested casually on her chin, fingers drumming a slow rhythm against her jaw. General Vexmorth expanded his presentation to include ground-based operations, the holographic display shifting to show surface engagements between various alien military forces. Sleek hover tanks exchanged energy beams across pristine battlefields, while aerial units conducted precision strikes with weapons that left perfectly circular craters in the simulated terrain. Modern ground warfare eliminates the chaotic variables that plagued our ancestors, the general explained, his crystalline features reflecting satisfaction. Gravity manipulation weapons can disable enemy forces without permanent damage. Consciousness disruption fields incapacitate opposition while preserving valuable infrastructure. Temporal stasis generators can freeze entire military formations in place, allowing for bloodless victory through superior tactical positioning. The display demonstrated each concept with flawless precision. Enemy units froze mid-advance, weapons fire curved around protected areas, and entire battalions simply stopped functioning as various exotic effects took hold. It was warfare as imagined by beings who had apparently never encountered Murphy's Law, friction, or the basic tendency of complex systems to fail at the worst possible moment. Questions? General Vexmorth asked, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone who expected nothing more challenging than requests for clarification on technical specifications. Several hands, claws, and various appendages rose throughout the amphitheater. The general fielded inquiries about energy output calculations, shield harmonization frequencies, and the finer points of quantum battlefield mathematics. Each question received a detailed technical response that seemed to satisfy the questioner completely. The human in the back corner remained silent, though her drumming fingers had shifted to a slightly different rhythm. Anyone familiar with Terran musical theory might have recognized it as a marching cadence, though such knowledge was notably absent among the assembled alien military experts. As the formal question period wound down, General Vexmorth prepared to transition into his closing remarks about the bright future of civilized warfare. His forearms moved in ceremonial patterns, while his holographic display shifted to show a galaxy-wide strategic overview, complete with trade routes, defensive perimeters, and optimal fleet deployment positions. The era of barbaric conflict has ended, he declared with finality. Through the application of advanced technology and superior tactical theory, warfare has been elevated from crude violence to an art form worthy of truly civilized species. It was at precisely that moment that a single hand rose in the back corner of the amphitheater. Not a claw, not a tentacle, not an energy projection or mechanical appendage, just a basic two-thumbed, five-fingered human hand attached to an arm that belonged to the one being in the room that every advanced civilization present had politely categorized as developmentally disadvantaged. Developmentally General Vexmor's primary eyes focused on the human with a kind of expression typically reserved for discovering something unpleasant on the bottom of one's foot. His secondary eyes continued monitoring the holographic display, while his tertiary senses automatically catalogued the biochemical signatures of surprise and barely controlled annoyance emanating from his crystalline form. "Yes?" he asked, the single word carrying enough condescension to power a small space station. The human marine rose to her feet with a kind of fluid motion that suggested either excellent physical conditioning or a complete lack of concern for the academic hierarchy she was about to disrupt. Every sensor, optical organ, and electromagnetic detection apparatus in the amphitheater swiveled to focus on this unexpected development. "Thank you, General," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater's acoustic enhancement systems. "I have a few questions about your theoretical framework, if you don't mind." The word theoretical hung in the air like a poorly timed diplomatic proposal. General Vexmor's crystalline features shifted through several color patterns that, had anyone present been fluent in Krekstar emotional displays, would have been recognized as the visual equivalent of grinding teeth. "Certainly," he replied, his harmonic undertones suggesting anything but certainty. "Though I should note that these are not theoretical concepts, but proven methodologies employed across dozens of successful military campaigns. And the Marine nodded with the kind of respectful attention that somehow managed to feel deeply disrespectful. Of course. I was wondering about your energy-based weapon systems. In your experience, how do they perform against opponents who employ reflective countermeasures? A ripple of interest passed through the audience. The Veltar Consortium representatives pulsed with curious bioluminescence, while several insectoid species clicked their mandibles in what approximated thoughtful consideration. General Vexmorth's holographic display flickered momentarily as he adjusted the parameters. Reflective countermeasures are naturally compensated for through frequency modulation and coherence adjustments. Any civilization advanced enough to deploy energy weapons has long since solved such elementary challenges. Fascinating, the Marine replied, settling back into her seat with the air of someone just getting comfortable. And what about opponents who use debris fields or particulate matter to disrupt coherent energy beams? Dust, for instance, or metallic fragments. The General's secondary eyes performed what could charitably be described as an eye roll, if eye rolls were possible for beings with compound crystalline optical organs. Environmental factors are easily managed through battlefield preparation. Atmospheric processors can clear debris fields, while gravitational manipulators remove particulate matter from operational zones. Right, the atmospheric processors, the Marine said, nodding thoughtfully. How long does that process typically take? Standard atmospheric clearing operations require approximately 6 to 8 standard time units, depending on the volume of material and local gravitational constants. The human's eyebrows rose slightly. 6 to 8 hours to clear a battlefield before you can effectively deploy energy weapons. A subtle shift occurred in the amphitheater's atmosphere, the kind of shift that typically preceded awkward questions at faculty meetings, or uncomfortable revelations during budget reviews. Several species in the audience began consulting their personal recording devices, cross-referencing the General's statements with their own military databases. The time investment ensures optimal operational conditions, General Vexmorth explained, his voice maintaining its authoritative tone, despite a slight harmonic fluctuation that suggested mild irritation. Proper preparation is the hallmark of civilized warfare. Absolutely, the Marine agreed with enthusiasm that somehow sounded exactly like polite skepticism. I'm curious about your temporal stasis generators. Impressive technology. What's the power consumption on those units? The General's holographic display shifted to show technical specifications for the devices in question. Streams of data flowed past in alien scripts, displaying energy requirements that would have made fusion reactor engineers weep with envy. Temporal manipulation requires significant energy investment, he acknowledged. Each stasis generator draws power equivalent to a small stellar collector array. And how many can you typically deploy in a standard engagement? Currently varies. Supplement numbers vary based on available infrastructure, but standard doctrine calls for a minimum of 12 units to ensure adequate battlefield coverage. The Marine's expression shifted to one of genuine fascination. So you need the power output of 12 small stars to freeze enemy forces in place. The energy requirements are substantial but manageable for any civilization with proper stellar engineering capabilities, the General replied, his confidence beginning to show. Hairline fractures, manageable, the Marine repeated, as if tasting the word. How long can you maintain that level of power draw? General Vexmorth's crystalline features cycled through several color patterns before settling on what appeared to be defensive amber. Operational duration depends on various factors, including enemy resistance levels, local space-time stability, and logistical support networks. Could you give me a ballpark figure? Hours? Days? Standard operational doctrine limits continuous temporal stasis deployment to no more than 2 standard time units to prevent cascade destabilization effects. A murmur rippled through the audience as various species performed rapid calculations on their personal devices. The Zephyrian delegation's feathered crests began rustling with what appeared to be consternation, while the mechanical beings from the Synthex Collective emitted a series of harmonized clicks that sounded distinctly like electronic concern. 2 hours, the Marine said, her tone suggesting she was filing this information away for future reference. And what happens if enemy forces don't cooperate by staying frozen for the full 2 hours? The General's display flickered again, showing various tactical scenarios where temporal stasis fields contain different types of opposition forces. Properly calibrated stasis fields maintain containment regardless of enemy countermeasures. Even if they use kinetic weapons to disrupt the field generators, kinetic weapons are ineffective against properly shielded temporal manipulation equipment. The Marine leaned forward slightly in her seat. What if they don't target the generators directly? What if they just throw rocks at them? The amphitheater fell silent except for the ambient hum of life support systems and the occasional electromagnetic pulse from nervous Veltar representatives. General Vexmore's forearms moved in patterns that suggested either complex calculations or the alien equivalent of fidgeting. Rocks, he asked, his harmonic undertones suggesting the word represented a concept he found personally offensive. At rocks, stones, chunks of metal, basic kinetic projectiles accelerated to high velocity through crude mechanical means. The Marine's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a particularly slow student. No advanced technology required, just mass times velocity equals impact force. The General's holographic display began cycling through various defensive scenarios, showing energy shields deflecting sophisticated weapons systems. Primitive kinetic attacks are easily countered through standard defensive protocols. Right, but I noticed your shields are optimized for energy absorption and redirection, the Marine observed. How do they handle simple momentum transfer? The display hesitated, flickering between different shield configurations as the General apparently searched for relevant data. The momentum transfer is accommodated through structural reinforcement and inertial dampening systems, so the shields don't actually stop kinetic projectiles. They just absorb the impact. The end result is identical, except for the part where your expensive temporal stasis generator gets hit by a rock and stops working. The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a concentrate of academic embarrassment. Several species in the audience had begun taking extensive notes, their recording devices working overtime to capture what was rapidly becoming the most educational military theory discussion in the Institute's recent history. General Vexmirth's crystalline features had shifted to a color pattern that experienced Kregstar observers would have recognized as the visual equivalent of someone desperately trying to change the subject. Perhaps, he said, his voice maintaining its authoritative tone through what appeared to be sheer force of will, the primitive human perspective simply lacks the sophistication to appreciate the elegant complexity of advanced warfare theory. The Marine smiled. It was not a particularly large smile, nor an especially threatening one, but it was the kind of smile that suggested the person wearing it had been waiting for exactly this moment throughout the entire lecture. You might be right, General, she said, rising to her feet once again. We humans do tend to keep things simple. The Marine smile had evolved from polite inquiry to something that would have made seasoned diplomats reach for their emergency evacuation protocols. She remained standing, hands clasped behind her back in a posture that suggested either military discipline or someone preparing to deliver very bad news with exceptional professionalism. Since you mentioned our primitive perspective, General, perhaps I could share some human observations about your elegant warfare theories. Her tone carried the dangerous courtesy typically employed by auditors discussing irregularities in expense reports. General Vexmorth's crystalline features cycled through what appeared to be rapid recalculations. By all means, he replied, though his harmonic undertone suggested he meant anything but. Let's start with your plasma shields, the Marine said, gesturing toward the holographic display that still showed various energy-based defensive systems. Impressive technology. They create a coherent field of superheated gas to deflect incoming energy weapons, correct? A somewhat simplified explanation, but essentially accurate. And plasma, being superheated gas, responds to pressure differentials and electromagnetic fields? The General's secondary eyes narrowed slightly. All metal responds to fundamental physical forces, yes. Excellent. So if I were to, hypothetically speaking, detonate a large chemical explosive upwind of your plasma shield, the resulting pressure wave would disrupt the field coherence? The holographic display flickered as the General apparently ran rapid simulations. Crude chemical explosives produce insufficient energy to significantly disrupt properly calibrated plasma containment fields. What if I used a really big explosive? The scale of chemical detonation required would be prohibitively massive and logistically impossible to deploy in a battlefield environment. The Marine nodded thoughtfully. You're probably right. Chemical explosives are pretty inefficient. What about nuclear devices? A collective intake of breath, atmospheric gas, and various other breathing mediums swept through the amphitheater. The Veltar Consortium representatives pulsed with alarmed bioluminescence. While several insectoid species' antennae twitched in patterns that suggested extreme concern, nuclear weapons are prohibited by 17 different galactic accords, General Vexmore stated firmly. No civilized species would resort to such barbaric methods. Oh, I'm not suggesting anyone would actually use them, the Marine replied, with the innocent tone of someone discussing theoretical physics rather than weapons of mass destruction. I'm just curious about the technical aspects. Hypothetically, would a nuclear detonation generate sufficient pressure and electromagnetic interference to disrupt your plasma shields? The General's crystalline features had shifted to a color pattern that suggested either deep thought or mild nausea. Theoretical nuclear effects would indeed present significant challenges to plasma field coherence, but such weapons are impractical and morally unacceptable. Impractical because they're banned or impractical because they don't work? They are impractical because civilized species recognize their devastating potential and choose not to employ them. The Marine's smile widened slightly. So they would work. You just choose not to use them because they're too effective. The silence that followed this observation was broken only by the frantic clicking of recording devices, as various species updated their threat assessment databases. The Zephyrian delegation had begun what appeared to be an emergency consultation, their feathered crests rustling with barely contained panic. Let's move on to your quantum entanglement communication networks, the Marine continued, apparently oblivious to the growing tension in the amphitheater. Instantaneous coordination across vast distances. Very impressive. How many entangled particle pairs do you need to maintain fleet-wide communications? General Vexmore seemed grateful for the change of subject. Standard fleet communications require approximately 10,000 entangled pairs per vessel, with redundant backups to ensure network stability. And these particles have to be generated and distributed before deployment. Naturally, quantum entanglement cannot be established in real time. All communication pairs must be prepared and positioned prior to operational commencement. What happens if some of those particles get destroyed during combat? The General's holographic display showed network diagrams with various connection points. Redundant systems ensure continued communication even with significant network degradation. How much degradation can you handle before the system fails? Standard protocols maintain functionality with up to 60% network loss. The Marine appeared to be performing mental calculations. So, if an enemy force managed to destroy more than 60% of your communication particles, your entire fleet coordination system would collapse. Such extensive destruction would require precise targeting of microscopic quantum particles dispersed across multiple star systems. The technical challenges are insurmountable. Unless someone just bombed your communication hubs. The holographic display stuttered momentarily. Communication hubs are heavily fortified and defended by multiple overlapping systems. With plasma shields, among other defensive measures, yes. The same plasma shields that can be disrupted by nuclear weapons. General Vexmoth's four arms began moving in increasingly agitated patterns. You continue to reference prohibited weapons that no civilized species would employ. I'm not suggesting anyone would, the Marine said with the patient tone of someone explaining something to a particularly stubborn child. I'm just trying to understand the logical structure of your defensive theories. She gestured toward the holographic display, which was beginning to show signs of strain as the General's control wavered. Your weapons require clear atmospheric conditions and substantial preparation time. Your shields can be disrupted by sufficient kinetic force or electromagnetic interference. Your communications depend on pre-positioned particles that can be destroyed by targeting central hubs. Your temporal weapons consume enormous amounts of energy and can only operate for limited durations. The amphitheater had grown so quiet that the ambient hum of life support systems sounded like industrial machinery. Every optical organ, sensor array, and electromagnetic detector was focused on the human Marine, with the kind of attention typically reserved for natural disasters or tax audits. It seems to me, she continued, her voice carrying clearly through the absolute silence, that your entire approach to warfare depends on your opponents being polite enough to fight according to your rules. General Vexmore's crystalline features had cycled through several color patterns before settling on what appeared to be defensive indignation. These are not arbitrary rules, but the fundamental principles of civilized conflict resolution. And what happens when you encounter someone who isn't civilized? The question hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance. Several species in the audience had begun consulting their personal devices with increasing urgency. apparently cross-referencing their own military doctrines against the scenarios the Marine had outlined. All spacefaring civilizations recognize the necessity of adhering to established protocols, the general replied, though his harmonic undertone suggested decreasing confidence in this assertion. Any species capable of achieving interstellar travel must possess sufficient sophistication to understand the benefits of regulated warfare. The Marine tilted her head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both curiosity and skepticism. That's an interesting assumption. What if they achieved interstellar travel through means you didn't anticipate? What if their technology developed along completely different lines? What if they never had the luxury of fighting civilized wars? General Vexmor's holographic display began cycling through various alien vessel configurations, showing the sleek, elegant designs favored by advanced civilizations. Technological development follows predictable patterns. Form follows function across all known species. Does it? The Marine asked. What if someone built their ships out of rocks? Rocks cannot achieve interstellar velocities or maintain structural integrity across interplanetary distances. What if they were really big rocks? The General's display flickered uncertainly. The mass requirements would be prohibitive. What if they didn't care about mass requirements? What if they just strapped engines to asteroids and pointed them at your planet? The silence that greeted this observation was profound enough to have its own gravitational field. The Veltar Consortium representatives had begun pulsing with colors that didn't appear in any standard xenobiological reference materials, while the mechanical beings from the Synthex Collective were emitting harmonized frequencies that sounded distinctly like electronic screaming. Such crude methodology would be strategically ineffective, General Vexmor stated, though his voice had acquired a slight tremor that suggested growing uncertainty. Asteroid-based vessels would be slow, unwieldy, and vulnerable to superior technology. Slow and unwieldy, yes, the Marine agreed. But what about vulnerable? How do you destroy something that's already a giant rock flying through space? The holographic display began showing various weapon effects on asteroid-like targets, with energy beams creating impressive, but ultimately cosmetic damage to massive stone surfaces. Superior firepower can overcome any defensive advantage, the General insisted. Can hit. How many plasma bolts does it take to vaporize a kilometer-wide asteroid? The display ran rapid calculations, showing energy output requirements that climbed steadily into ranges that would have made stellar engineers weep. Sufficient energy application can eliminate any target. And while you're spending hours vaporizing one asteroid, what happens when 50 more show up? General Vexmor's crystalline features had achieved a color pattern that suggested either deep philosophical contemplation or the onset of severe migraine equivalent. 50 asteroids would represent an unprecedented logistical undertaking, would it? Asteroids are pretty common in most star systems. All you need is engines and navigation systems. No life support, no crew quarters, no sophisticated defensive measures, just rocks with rocket motors. The Marine paused, allowing this image to settle in the minds of her increasingly disturbed audience. Of course, that's assuming they bother with navigation systems. What if they just aimed them in the general direction and let physics handle the rest? The amphitheater had achieved the kind of silence typically associated with funeral services or particularly awkward family dinners. General Vexmorth appeared to be experiencing the intellectual equivalent of system failure, his four arms moving in random patterns while his holographic display cycled through increasingly desperate defensive scenarios. You present scenarios that violate every principle of strategic thinking, he finally managed. The Marine nodded sympathetically. From your perspective, absolutely. But that's kind of my point, General. What happens when your sophisticated theories encounter someone who never read the manual? The Marine's question echoed through the amphitheater. General Vexmorth stood motionless except for color shifts across his crystalline features, patterns suggesting a mind grappling with unfamiliar concepts. Perhaps, he said finally, you could enlighten us about human military doctrine since you find our methods so inadequate. The Marine smiled. I'd be happy to share observations, General. In your elegant warfare theories, how much time do you spend studying enemies? Comprehensive intelligence gathering is fundamental. Standard doctrine requires detailed analysis of enemy capabilities and strategic limitations. How long does this take? Thorough assessment requires 12 to 18 standard time units. What if they don't give you 12 hours? What if they attack during your analysis? The general's display shifted to defensive configurations. Preliminary measures can be implemented while analysis continues. The same measures we've discussed. Plasma shields that can be disrupted, networks that can be severed, temporal weapons consuming massive power. The general's silence carried weight. Throughout the amphitheater, species began emergency consultations with military databases. Here's the thing about human warfare, General. We don't fight elegant wars, we fight to win, using whatever works, adapting faster than enemies can compensate. She gestured toward the display. Your plasma shields are impressive, but humans would use kinetic weapons. Your energy weapons are elegant, but we'd attack during atmospheric disturbances. Your quantum networks are sophisticated, but we'd target infrastructure with explosives. The alien representatives pulsed with alarmed colors and clicked emergency patterns. You spent hours preparing battlefields. We adapt to whatever we find. You optimize for perfect conditions. We train for worst-case scenarios and assume reality will be worse. General Vexmurth's features shifted to colors suggesting worldview collapse. But surely human technology follows similar principles. The Marine laughed. General, we build weapons assuming they'll be used by sleep-deprived teenagers in hostile environments with no maintenance support. We design tactics assuming everything will go wrong. We train soldiers to accomplish missions when equipment fails, communications are cut, and commanders are dead. The display flickered as the general processed this. Such assumptions would lead to inefficient allocation. What happens when your plasma shield breaks down in combat? Redundant backups ensure continued operation, and when those break too, secondary redundancies provide additional layers. And when everything breaks because someone threw a rock at your power supply, complete silence. Humans expect equipment failure. A human soldier fights effectively with broken rifles, compromised communications, and no command support. Can your warriors function when their shields are down and communicators are offline? The general's arms moved erratically. Advanced civilizations rely on technology reliability. What happens when that technology encounters something unexpected? Your energy weapons fight other energy weapons. Your shields deflect sophisticated attacks. Your communications depend on predictable infrastructure. She paused. Humans fight dirty. We use whatever works. If sophisticated weapons are effective, we'll use them. If rocks work better, we'll throw rocks. Species updated threat assessments in real time, but the most important difference is that humans study enemies while fighting them. We don't spend 18 hours analyzing capabilities. We learn weaknesses during combat and adapt accordingly. The general's display showed frantic defensive scenarios. Adaptive tactics require extensive training and command structures. Human doctrine assumes command structures will be disrupted. We train soldiers to make tactical decisions independently. Every warrior learns to think like a general. The Marine looked around the amphitheater. You've built elegant militaries for predictable wars against rational opponents. Humans prepare for chaotic conflicts against unpredictable enemies who will use any method to achieve victory. She turned back to the general. Your warfare is a science. Precise, calculated, optimized. Human warfare is an art form. Improvisational, adaptive, and effective under any circumstances. The display showed elegant alien formations versus chaotic human deployments. I believe human military philosophy may warrant further study, he said slowly. The Marine smiled. I'd be happy to continue this discussion after class. She settled back while species frantically updated databases and reassessed assumptions about primitive weapons. General Vexmorth stood motionless, then shut down the displays. Class dismissed, he announced hollowly. As alien minds filed out an existential crisis, the Marine remained seated, reviewing notes. She had come to learn about alien warfare theories, and the education had exceeded expectations. The universe ensured important lessons came from unexpected teachers. Sometimes, sophisticated theories crumbled when confronted by someone who never learned certain questions weren't supposed to be asked.